As I mentioned earlier, this program takes us into the realm of psychology and pathology, and there are many pathological states. And the vampire, a vampiristic person, could fall under several of those categories. That doesn't mean that a person with a pathological problem, a pathological syndrome like, say, neurosis, is necessarily a vampire or a vampiristic kind of person. But it does mean that if you ever encounter or observe a vampiristic person, it's more than likely that they will have or show aspects that psychologists are familiar with, aspects of these other pathological states. As I said, there's a long list of these pathological states, but in the length of our program, we have time only to visit and analyze or study 3 of them, 3 very important ones. We'll be studying the neurotic vampire, the narcissistic vampire, and the sociopathic or psychopathic vampire. Let's start with the neurotic vampire. Now, many people suffer from psychiatric maladies. Carl Goldberg says that a study of representative sample of 8,098 Americans found that 48% suffered from at least one psychiatric problem during their lifetime. And of course, these pathological states, there's a whole spectrum of them. They can be benign, like histrionic personality disorder, to the more extreme ones of sadistic personality disorder, and of course, vampirism. When it comes to neurosis, we find that it's on the increase. Alexander Lowen, in his book Narcissism, says, "I have seen a marked change in the personality problems of the people consulting me. The neuroses of earlier times, represented by the incapacitating guilts, anxieties, phobias, or obsessions, are not commonly seen today. Instead, I see more people who complain of depression. They describe a lack of feeling and inner emptiness, a deep sense of frustration and unfulfillment. This absence of feeling gives one the impression of unreality about these people. Their performance, socially, sexually, and in the work world, seems too efficient, too mechanical, too perfect to be human. They function more like machines than people." In fact, the term neurosis is rarely used. Since about the 1980s, psychologists and psychiatrists and clinicians prefer to speak of a neurotic personality trait. Pathological states of consciousness, irrational states of consciousness, include neurosis, psychosis, schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder, manic depressiveness, obsessive compulsive, paranoid, the sociopathic or antisocial type. There's narcissism, sadism, there's dependent personality disorder, depersonalization, derealization, dissociation, fanaticism, phobia, aggression, and of course, let's never forget the passive aggression. But psychologists like Erich Fromm are really aware that these so-called disorders are basically surface disorders. They themselves have a deeper etiology, a deeper and earlier cause. They overlie something even more profound, even more deeply seated in the psyche. Fromm says that most of the symptoms that are given by mainstream psychologists and psychiatrists for people are themselves but side effects of deeper psychic issues. So when we hear terms like depression or split personality or obsessive compulsive, etc., we think that this explains something when it only partially diagnoses the situation. A greater existential condition exists below these comfortably vague technical phrases. And one of those deeper causes, I think it was mentioned briefly earlier, is the whole question of suffering, the avoidance of suffering. We don't want to look at it. We don't want to acknowledge or give language to the hurts and the sufferings that we've experienced. We're against what Jung called legitimate suffering and loath to examine the whole question of what we've lost in order to become ourselves. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it, that we've all experienced more failures and setbacks in life than we have had successes. Well, that's just the way it is. Instead of having a problem with that, accept it. Be okay with it. Look at the fact that you have had successes and look at those other setbacks as challenges. That's the more healthy attitude to take. But when it comes to the actual origin of these so-called disorders, we've already seen that they grow out of a chronic need for approval as well as the avoidance of self-knowledge. They arise from our misuse of free will, because some have argued that free will only applies to whether we choose to be ourselves or not. And that's worth repeating again. That's right, many philosophers, many psychologists have said, look, the only free will you really have is the free will to decide whether you're going to be yourself or not. As Michel Foucault and so many other great thinkers understood, maybe all other kinds of freedom, political and social and what have you, that's just phraseology, that's just rhetoric. When you really closely examine these concepts, you don't find much back of them. But what you decide in your own mind, that's an act of free will. So if there is any free will, it's the free will to be yourself or not, as the case may be. And Scott Peck is aware of this dynamic of how much we've lost in order to be the people we are today. In his book, The Road Less Traveled, he lists some of these transitions or rites of passage. He says we have to, in life, outgrow our state of infancy, our fantasy of omnipotence, our desire for total dominion and possession over others. We have to outgrow our dependencies, our false ideas about our parents, our fantasy of immortality. Later in life, we have to give up our authority over our children or the power that we've received. Towards the end of our lives, we have to give up our physical health and physical agility. And then finally, we all have to give up life itself. I've often emphasized in my work also that any kind of disorders, all these pathological disorders that we're discussing here are ultimately boil down to a way of seeing. You can see life in a godly way, you can see life in a devilish or demonic way. It all boils down to a way of seeing. And if it is accepted that it's a way of seeing, then we have total choice over that way of seeing. If we can be dependent, we can be independent. We don't necessarily need a man in a white coat to adjust us or fix us so that we make the change. We can do it ourselves. If we're one way, it implies that we can, by way of choice and correct exercise of free will, be another way. And Frank Bruno addresses this concept of way of seeing in his book, It's Okay to be Neurotic. He says that the cognitive viewpoint asserts that neurosis is due to thinking incorrectly about the world, including the social world of other people. One of the principal founding figures associated with this viewpoint, Albert Ellis, states that irrational ideas induce adverse emotional states. So irrational ideas, irrational ways of seeing. We've got to look into why we have those irrational ideas. We've got to question whether we see reality as it really is, or do we have ideas about reality? Art Martin, he says, there is no disease, illness, or dysfunctional behavior that just comes in and affects us by happenstance. Your mind controls every action you take and every situation that happens to you. S.H. Folks, in the book Psychotherapy, says, the original neurotic manifestation in the childhood situation is but a symptom of a total constellation, a family neurosis, so to speak. The acute neurotic breakdown in the adult is a product of interactional processes in which a number of people are actively involved. He's basically saying there that neurosis isn't organic, it's environmental. Its roots are in the domestic situation and in the relationship between the self and the world at large.